Anyone who watches films regularly knows that there are certain actors that start their careers in big franchises that make a ton of money before moving on to more experimental and acclaimed projects as they get older in their careers. While that may be the case for some of the best working actors today, it is almost the complete opposite for NFL coaching legends as they reach the twilight of their careers. There have been a handful of NFL coaches that have sustained success in maybe one or two places, winning Super Bowls and developing Hall of Famers, just to end their careers in the most random places possible, with the surrounding storylines making them even more unique, both for the better and for the worse. Every coaching legend doesn't get to ride off into the sunset with the teams that we know them for, and these 4 coaches we're talking about today had some of the most unique career endings of all time. My name is Caleb, and we always talk about certain players being on random rosters to end their careers, but we rarely ever talk about the coaches that also have fairly different endings to their stories relative to the rest of their careers. It's always interesting how they went from the places where they became legends to the one where it might be more forgettable, and unlike the players who get older, coaches have to deal with a whole other set of factors that contribute to their end-of-career moves. And for the coach who inspired this video, and the first one we're talking about today, they had maybe the most publicized coaching move possibly in the history of the sport. If Tom Brady of all people wasn't going to finish his career with the Patriots, then it was almost for sure that Bill Belichick wasn't going to either. Those last few seasons of Belichick in New England were the worst of his career as a head coach, and it was a non-notable ending to a tenure that saw him win 6 Super Bowls over the course of 20 years. There are a lot of people that regard him as the greatest NFL coach of all time, and it's definitely hard to argue against it. He's 3rd all-time in career wins as a head coach and has the most Super Bowl wins and appearances in the same role. Along with building such a unique football culture in an organization that had only had success in spurts before the 2000s, it's pretty wild that Belichick wasn't one of the most sought-out names during the 2024 offseason after he was let go by the Patriots at the end of the 2023 season. He finished 3 of his last 4 seasons in New England, missing the playoffs, and his final season saw him lose the locker room, and the Patriots finished 4-13. Their worst record since Belichick became head coach in 2000. He'd get one NFL interview from the Falcons before they'd eventually hire Raheem Morris, and Bill Belichick was out of football completely for the 2024 season. It's not super often where you see an NFL head coach of that caliber move into college football instead of vice versa, but arguably the greatest coach of all time decided that he was going to take his expertise to Chapel Hill. Bill Belichick was named the head coach in North Carolina before the 2025 season, and it may have been the most unique offseason and hiring for any coach in the history of college football. While yes, Bill Belichick could still coach for a while after UNC, we can assume that this is probably one of his final stops. The hiring of Belichick was unique on its own, but it had maybe the most involvement of a significant other than any other hiring in recent sports history. His girlfriend Jordan Hudson, who was born after he had already won his first Super Bowl, was reportedly involved in almost every facet of the hiring process. This isn't to say that people close to you shouldn't know what's going on with your job, but there were moments that truly had you questioning how much influence she had over the UNC football program. She was being copied into emails, attending practices, and allegedly had a role in getting UNC's Hard Knocks appearance on HBO canceled. Most notably though, her and Bill were a part of one of the most awkward interviews of all time where she advised Bill not to talk about how they'd met, which does raise some eyebrows, but that's a conversation for another day. With such a tumultuous offseason, the actual football being played in Chapel Hill has also not been the greatest. The Tar Heels have been a below average power conference team, and he's even banned Patriot scouts from attending team practices, returning the favor in the event that he is allegedly banned from the facilities in New England himself. Though the Belichick era at UNC has been very disappointing so far and could be ending very soon, it's been nothing short of entertaining on a non-football level. Belichick in Carolina Blue is the only head coach that went from the NFL to college football that we'll talk about today, but the next head coach we'll discuss went from the 1985 Bears to the late 90s Saints, 2 franchises at the time who had a completely contrasting outlook on winning. Mike Ditka is one of the more interesting personalities in NFL history, especially coming from a coaching standpoint. Before he was ever considering a career in coaching, he was arguably considered the greatest tight end in NFL history pre-merger, being named a 5-time All-Pro and 5-time Pro Bowl selection in 12 seasons between the Bears, Eagles, and Cowboys. After his retirement in 1972, he was hired as an assistant by Tom Landry in Dallas, where he remained for 9 years. But in the meantime, he was really gunning for that head coaching job in Chicago. His relationship with Bears owner George Halas had soured during his playing days over a contract extension, but time heals most wounds, and by the early 80s, Ditka and Halas had reconciled enough to where he was hired by the Bears to be their next head coach ahead of the 1982 season. And during Ditka's 11-season stint in Chicago, the Bears saw their most successful decade in franchise history. In 11 years, the Bears would make the playoffs 7 times, win the NFC Central 6 times, and put together arguably the greatest defense ever that culminated in the 1985 Bears becoming the Super Bowl champions. Bears fans of the 1980s saw their team under Coach Ditka become a cultural phenomenon and one of the winningest coaches of the decade. He won 2 NFL Coach of the Year awards, and alongside his playing career in Chicago, Mike Ditka became one of the more iconic Chicago sports figures ever, but all great things must come to an end. In 1992, Mike Ditka was fired after the team went 5-11 and missed the playoffs for the second time in 4 years. After a 4-year hiatus from coaching, he was hired by the Saints prior to the 1997 season, and disaster is not enough of a word to describe his 3 years in New Orleans. Anytime a franchise brings in a coach that's proven to win and has sustained success, you can't be mad if a fan base is excited for it. But the NFL in the 90s was not what it was during the 80s. The league at the time was becoming a much more pass-first league than it was the decade before, but Ditka's offensive philosophy was still run first as if he still had Walter Payton, and this led to arguably one of the worst trades in NFL history. In his first 2 seasons in New Orleans, they would go 6-10 in both years with no real sense of identity, an average offense at best, a worse defense, and a consistently shuffling quarterback room. This led to them having the 12th overall pick in the 1999 NFL Draft, and Ditka had his eye on someone who he literally thought could be his next Walter Payton. And I mean, to be fair to Ricky Williams, he was no slouch of a prospect. He was just coming off of winning the Heisman for his 1998 season at Texas and had one of the best running back careers in college football history, going for 6,500 yards and 75 touchdowns during his 4 years in Austin. But I don't know anyone in their right mind who would trade their entire draft plus multiple picks in the next year's draft to move up to number 5 to take Williams. Ditka was adamant that the Saints made this move, and as the architect of the trade, the Saints traded their 1999 first, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and 7th round picks and their 2000 first and third round picks to Washington just to take Williams 5th overall. Washington's front office at the time was probably laughing so hard because they were getting essentially an entire draft for a player who hadn't played an NFL down yet. And like a short-lived marriage, the Ditka and Williams partnership with the Saints didn't last very long. The Saints won 3 games during their 1999 season, and Ditka was fired shortly after. Williams played alright with the Saints, but would go on to become an All-Pro with the Dolphins just a few years later. For Ditka to be considered one of the most legendary coaches of all time, he also had one of the worst final coaching tenures ever, highlighted by a trade that set a franchise back an entire decade that even then was fairly soon to have recovered from a trade so disastrous. Our next coach is arguably the most iconic coach we're going to talk about today, and we have to go back a few more decades to get to his peak. Because when you think of NFL football in the 1960s, it's hard not to immediately picture Vince Lombardi on a Packers sideline on a cold afternoon. What we know now as the Lombardi Trophy is named after him, and it might be the most fitting name for a championship trophy in all of sports. Vince Lombardi's final act as a coach wasn't weird due to the lack of success or a really bad move being made, but just the simple fact that the winningest coach in NFL history up to that point didn't end his career with the Packers, which was just unusual to see. And the reason for that is because his 9 seasons in Green Bay were so legendary. In 1958, with the team performing poorly and on the brink of folding as a franchise, Lombardi stepped in as head coach and GM, gained full control of football operations, and the rest was history. He turned the franchise around and won the NFL Coach of the Year in 1959, and by year 3, he had led the Packers to their first NFL championship in 1961, something they'd repeat in 1962 and in 65. In 1966, the league would enter the Super Bowl era where the NFL and the then competing AFL would come together for pro football's ultimate championship, and Lombardi would win the first 2 Super Bowls ever. From 1959 to 1967, Lombardi would have a record of 89, 29, and 4, including 9 playoff wins and 5 championships. It's no mystery why the Lombardi Trophy is named after him today, but he also played a real part in normalizing the integration of the NFL. He was one of the first coaches in all of American sports to have an anti-discrimination philosophy, and during his tenure as Packers coach, the team became one of the first fully integrated football teams in the history of the sport. But in 1968, Lombardi felt burnt out from his dual role in Green Bay as coach and GM, and resigned from his head coaching duties but continued as the team's GM. A year later in 1969 though, his time in Green Bay would come to an end in its entirety, and he'd leave for Washington wanting to take on a new challenge, which was exactly the case. Lombardi's tenure in Washington would only last 1 year, as he'd lead them to their first winning record in 14 years. Lombardi is kind of considered an unsung hero in Washington, as he indirectly saved the team. A few more mediocre to bad seasons could have saw the franchise fold, and his one and only year in DC was enough to implement a similar culture that he had brought to Green Bay, and players actually wanted to come play for him. Lombardi adapted to the ever-changing game better than almost anyone in the history of the sport could have, implementing new blocking schemes and tailoring the offense around star quarterback Sonny Jurgensen. Everything was going great in Washington for the brief Lombardi stint, but his time would be cut all too short. Lombardi passed away during the 1970 offseason at age 57 due to colon cancer, but the changes he implemented there that allowed them to build on their winning ways and culture that they bring into the 70s and 80s says a lot about the impact that Lombardi was able to make in his non-Packer year as head coach. Lombardi's final career act was only weird in the sense that he didn't end his career with the Packers and that we typically only think of him in Green Bay, but he's honestly the only coach we've talked about so far that left the place better than he found it, which is never an easy thing to do as a head coach. There aren't many former head coaches that could say they were also the founder of the team that they coached, but there's only one person that can say that was the case in two different instances, and for that reason, Paul Brown has maybe had the most unique head coaching career in the history of the sport. Not only was he a co-founder of the Cleveland Browns back in 1944, but the team was named after himself, if you were ever curious where the name came from. He was named the franchise's first ever head coach, and the Browns began their existence in a short-lived league called the All-American Football Conference. They moved to the NFL in 1950, and contrary to their losing ways now, Paul Brown had this franchise position as one of the most successful teams in sports. Along with his 4 championships in the AAFC in the 40s, he won 3 championships in the NFL during the 1950s and only had 1 losing record as the Browns head coach. But during his later years in Cleveland, things began to sour a bit between him and the organization he once founded. There was a little beef between Paul Brown and Jim Brown, who had been drafted in 1957 and immediately became one of the league's best players. As Jim Brown became more popular off the field, Paul Brown became somewhat jealous and thought he was losing control of his team. Not only did Paul not like his players' off the field ventures, he was very quick to throw his own players under the bus when things didn't quite go right on the field. By 1961, Paul Brown was on borrowed time in Cleveland as Art Modell would buy the team and Brown's remaining ownership stake. He remained a part of the team as head coach, but hated how involved Modell was in football operations. Art Modell started to become really close with the players, and as the players' relationships were already on the rocks with their head coach, Modell heard about it firsthand. By some accounts, it was all a part of an elaborate scheme to push Paul Brown out of Cleveland. After the two never repaired their relationship, Modell fired Paul Brown in 1963 and was out of football for the first time in over 30 years. He was still vice president of the team, but in title only though, as he didn't really have any responsibilities with the franchise. Essentially, he was bought out from his contract but was still being paid on a yearly basis. With that money in 1967, Brown would join an ownership group for a new franchise that was to be founded in Cincinnati. Paul Brown officially co-founded the Cincinnati Bengals of the AFL and became the team's first head coach and GM, just like he had done with the Browns a few decades earlier. There's nothing that is officially documented that proves this, but I have to assume that Paul Brown is the only person in the history of American sports to have founded, owned, and coached 2 separate professional franchises. His time as Bengals head coach wasn't nearly as successful as his tenure in Cleveland was, only making it to the playoffs 3 times, but the Bengals were one of the teams that made the transition from the AFL to the NFL during the merger and had a fairly extensive coaching tree that included another one of the greatest coaches ever in Bill Walsh, who served as one of Brown's original assistants in Cincinnati and also became the birthplace of what would later be known as the West Coast offense. Paul Brown retired in 1975 and remained the Bengals team president until his death in 1991. Even though he had a mixed bag of relationships with his players and the people who would eventually coach under him, he's still one of the more unique figures in NFL history, and his final act as head coach in Cincinnati also factored into the team's founding and ownership, something we probably won't ever see again. Coaches typically go until they no longer feel the desire to coach anymore. If you have sustained success in the league and don't burn too many bridges, there's not too much that'll keep you from getting one more final act as head coach. While most coaches don't ride off into the sunset as Super Bowl champ or on great terms with everyone, it's such an interesting thing to see how a career comes to an end. So when I say the word weird final acts, it's not necessarily a bad thing all the time. Like for Lombardi and Paul Brown, they laid the foundation for 2 franchises that they would take into the future. But for Ditka and Bill Belichick, it's the complete opposite, where they could be setting their franchise and program back multiple years respectively. My name is Caleb. If you want to support the channel, please like and subscribe. I appreciate y'all for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.